Today is 19th of October 2010. I'm Bob Soba at the Warhawk Air Museum in Nampa, Idaho. I will be interviewing Jack Edwards for our Veterans History Project in partnership with the Library of Congress. The camera operator is Don Carlson. Jack, I'd like to welcome you here, and could you state for the record your full name
Jack Gary Edwards,
and your address?
7219 Bay Meadows Drive, Nampa, Idaho, 83687.
Okay, and your date of birth?
November 24th, 1924.
And what branch of the military were you in?
The U.S. Navy.
And how long did you serve?
I served just short of 2 years.
Okay.
I was a short timer.
Hey, Jack, we'd like to start off by telling us where you were born.
I was born up at Fairfield, Idaho, on the Little Camas Prairie.
And what did your parents do?
My dad, for the most part, was county auditor and clerk of the court, elected office. Mother was a homemaker.
Okay. And did you grow up in Fairfield then?
I've spent my full life in Fairfield from birth through high school.
Okay, so you went to high school at Fairfield
Yes,
and graduated up there. And
yes.
okay. Can you remember on when the day Pearl Harbor happened and what you were doing? And
I really don't for sure, but a lot of that is just my memories for today.
okay.
Anyway,
Anyway,
remember it anyway.
yeah, you knew the war was coming, and you were what year when high school were you then when that happened?
I graduated out of high school in 42. It was early 41 or 40 that Pearl Harbor was.
Yeah. Late 41.
Yeah.
So anyway, you were basically a senior when that happened, and then
That's right.
you graduated that fall, and you undoubtedly knew that you were prime age to go into the military at some point. So
I figured that I would go into the military, yes.
So after high school, what did you do then?
I had worked for the ranchers and the farmers from the time I was old enough to do a job on a farm till I went till I got out of high school, and where I had operated tractors on the farm, you figured if you could run one tractor, you could run any of them.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I went from the farm, they were building Anderson Dam at the time, and I went over there and worked as an oiler on the shovels first, and then I went to driving Uke, which was the big dirt moving trucks, and I did some cat work there just starting. But I was 17 at that time, and today they wouldn't even let you on the job at that, but they were short of help. And if you could do the job, they let you do it.
Mm-hmm. So how long did you
work for big wages? $1.15 an hour on those dirt movers.
So how long did you do that?
Well, I worked there for, I'm a first class BSer, but I worked there for a couple of years before I went in the military. I might tell you this, that before I'd went to Anderson Dam working, there was 4 of us that had got out of high school at Fairfield, Old Camas High, and we went to, there was Sig Anderson, Leland Anderson, Walt Johnson, and myself traveled from Fairfield down to Boise to enlist in the Marines. Well, two of them got in, Walt Johnson and Sig Anderson, but Leland or Fats Anderson and myself had poor sight, and we couldn't pass the exam, so they sent us home. And we worked on the farms, and like I say, I worked on the farms, operating equipment to where I figured one tractor is the same as another, just farm boy style. That was your outlook on life. And I worked over there, and then I tended to follow construction till I went in the Navy.
Okay, so when you worked at Anderson Dam, you worked there for 2 years, is that what you said?
Probably 2 years before I went in service, or the better part of 2 years. I'll modify it that way so you don't catch me on time too much.
So that was quite a project.
It was, and you know, I look back now, Anderson Dam, or the dam out here above Boise, it costs more for one of these overpasses than it did for either one of those dams today.
Changed a lot. Well, that was quite an experience working on a dam like that too. So,
Yeah.
so after you get done with that, then what happened? So,
Well, there was the draft come to where a number of the young fellas on Camas Prairie, their folks farmed, or they were, in order to keep the farm going, these young folks was exempt. I had the opportunity because I was farm labor that I could have stayed as farm labor, but I told the secretary of the draft board, whenever you get a compliment that goes to the Navy, they were just starting to take personnel for the Navy as well as the Army and Air Force. I said, whenever you get a draft for that, put my name on it. And he did. It wasn't hardly a month, and he told me they had personnel for the Navy, and that's when I went into the Navy.
okay. And then you said you went to an aircraft school. Now this was
Prior to that, now see, I'm piling it up. I went from where I first started to Anderson. I come down here the winter of 43, 44, and I went to U.S. Government Aircraft Maintenance School just before I went into the Navy.
and so you went there for how long?
6 months.
And
And
what
I-
did you learn to do there?
Service aircraft. Obviously, in 6 months, you weren't a full-fledged mechanic, but a lot of aircraft stuff we did was replacement parts.
Mhm.
If a part went out, why, it was replaced with new rather than repair. But just general maintenance.
And you were at Gown Field?
I could have went to up to Spokane, to Denver. There was a number of military bases you could have gone to, and I didn't go ahead. And when I got out of school, because of, well, the war and conditions, I didn't go ahead and take a job at an air base. I went shortly after that. I went into the Navy.
So your aircraft training was in Boise then?
Yes.
Okay. And so you did that for about 6 months, and then
For a full 6 months, and then they give you a test, and if you could pass, why, you went into, could be sent to a base to work.
so then they let you get in the Navy in June of 1944.
June 24th, 1944,
Okay. And then where did you go for boot
I
camp?
went up to Farragut for boot camp.
Was that
was
your-
it.
Was that your first time away from home?
Well, yes, other than I had spent 6 months in Boise going to that aircraft school.
Okay. So even boot camp, you're still in Idaho, although
That's
it's quite
right.
a ways away. So what was your feelings of boot camp when you got to Farragut?
Well, to me, it was kind of a big game. Things that bothered, physical things that bothered some of them, didn't bother me, like doing your own laundry. I seen guys that was in tears because they had to do their own laundry by hand. There was such as that. I enjoyed physical things. We played cops and robbers, so to speak, in the wooded area. We had whaleboat races on the lake there, where it was row and crew, but it just to teach you things that you might use in the Navy. We had physical fitness course. You'd run the physical fitness course. I was young and just out of school where it had been athletics and that fitness course, I got a kick out of it.
You enjoyed it.
Yes. But it was simple. Then there was a delay, and when we completed, there was a period of time that we doubled up on stuff before I was sent to outgoing unit and sent to a station.
So how long were you in boot camp?
And boot camp was 13 weeks, I think. It's pretty close.
Okay. So then when you get done, then they send you to where?
Well, they go into an outgoing unit, and you could be scheduled to go to any Navy base or ship. And I was sent from, because of that aircraft school, which they question you as what did you do, what were your qualifications in life? Well, a young guy, he don't have too many. And I was sent to California, unbeknownst to just what it was, but I was sent to Navy Ordnance Test Depot in California. And that was where, at that time, ordnance test, we had sights and rockets. Rockets were just coming in, and we'd run tests. The Navy provided, we got one of the first 16 planes that was built for the Navy, whether it was fighters, dive bombers, personnel. We'd get one plane at least, and they used them as a test to set up and study sights and rockets in combat planes. We had some personnel planes like the R-4D, which was personnel, but I first went to California. I stopped at San Diego. And then from San Diego, I went out to the Mojave Desert, which is a far cry from the ocean. Went out to what was Armitage Field at that time. And it was a small unit, maybe 300 of us, officers and men. Then they built China Lake Oh, it must have been 6, 8, maybe 10 miles away. China Lake Ordnance Test Station, and was moved from Armitage Field to China Lake. And I spent time there until I got out of the Navy in March 28th, 46.
So, what did you do at China Lake then?
At China Lake, when I first went out there, I went into parts. We was living in Quonsets out there on the desert at Armitage Field, but I went into working parts, and I worked with a first class that he'd tell me right off the bat. He said, "I'll help you, and you help me. And we work together, we'll get something done. But otherwise, if you don't want to back me up, why, we won't get along too well." Well, we did get along. We would even get, because we were setting up a new station, we had a parts department where our aircraft was a lot like the Marines, and the Marine base in Mojave. Why, he'd check out a little cargo truck and he'd say, "Let's go down to Marine Base in Mojave." And we'd go down there and make ourselves acquainted and filch parts. We would get anything like an F6 Grumman, F4U Corsair. We had a couple of different bombers. Well, if the Marines had parts that we could use, we'd get them. Tires and brakes was a big thing, but we'd get a load of those parts and bring them back and stock our parts department. And it was theft at the bottom, I guess, but it was done without no record, and he was smart enough to know how to do it. He had been in the Navy for probably 16 years before, and he knew pretty much the ropes. And he hated service on the desert, so he always was wanting to leave. And in the Navy, you could put in for transfer every 30 days. If you didn't like the service, you put in for transfer. And if you were on a land base and you put in for transfer to sea duty, that was a known fact. Ordinarily you'd get it, but the priority on rockets and sites, that test work, even with him, with a lot of it that I worked with him, you could put in for transfer, but they wouldn't transfer you off that base.
Too valuable. Huh?
Yeah, well, it was a project that they were, like rockets, they were working on pretty intensely, and rockets have stayed plumb from that time early in World War II up until date.
Okay. And so, was you in China Lake all until you got out of the Navy then?
Then yes, I was at Armitage Field and China Lake. It virtually was Armitage Field had been a air transport base, and then it was taken over from the civilian side, and then they built the new China Lake Ordnance Test Station, which was much bigger and better.
Mm-hmm. So how many people were at China Lake?
Well, if there was 300 at Armitage Field when I went there, officers and men, I don't know how many thousand there was civilian and Navy personnel by the time the war ended. Mm-hmm. I'd be guessing.
And so your duty was to make sure when someone, a mechanic needed a part, and you got the part.
Well, I worked parts, and then from parts I went to my friend Reese. He transferred out, got out, and when he transferred, I worked tires and brakes for quite a while, and then I worked that was just whenever there was tires or brakes to be done. That's what the engineering officer would come out in the morning. The pilot would make out a deficiency on his aircraft. Then in the morning, the engineering officer would hand out those work projects to the different mechanics, and you'd work those. I went from tires and brakes I worked line crew for a while, what they call line crew, and planes that were scheduled to fly that day. Why, if you were on the line crew, you took care maybe from 1 to 2 or 3, maybe fighters. The bigger planes, there'd be a crew chief just for that plane. Well, you made sure that they were fueled up, serviced properly, oil and that. But then whenever they were to fly and put on the flight schedule for the day, you went out in the morning, or if it was a night flight, you went out and turned that plane up and warmed it up, ready to go. So they checked it out. There was a checklist that we'd have. And I can tell you this, for being a farm boy, and I first went there, I had an F-6 fighter. Well, had to turn it up. That was an experience which I had worked mechanical in the school of running up test stand stuff, but not getting in the plane itself. And I tell you, I like to push the brakes through the floor, and I would be turning up the plane, and another line crewman would man the fire extinguishers. When you started them, you choked them, and the gas would run out and overflow. Well, if you fired it and she took, the prop blew that fire out if it caught in that gas. But if it coughed and didn't go, well, you had a fire under the plane, and that's where working as a team, the guy that was outside, another friend of mine, or on the flight crew, he'd man the fire extinguisher when I started my plane, run it up. Then I would go over later and I'd man a fire extinguisher when he started his, one or more. Simple enough. But then I got on hydraulics, and I worked on the hydraulics crew, and I even worked on engine change. If we had engines that had so many hours on them, we would pull the whole engine and replace it with another engine. It wasn't like we overhauled a car or anything. You just changed it, but there were a lot of things that you did and picked up and did. Now, I got to thinking, how did these sailors or maintenance guys that were, hey, when you passed 20, you was getting to be an oldster. But how did we do it? Well, whenever we would have a job to do, an engineering chief would pass out this work, we'd go up to the tech orders room, and we'd tech orders on how to remove a part and replace it, or how to do this work, and you'd read that and replace a part. If it was a oleo strut on the landing gear was leaking, why, you went up and read about how you took the oleo out on the right-hand wheel of, like if it was an F-6 fighter or an F-4U Corsair fighter. You just did it. You read, and I guess with the confidence that you had, then there was superiors that would check you out, to check the work out afterwards. But we got the job done.
So did you get time off or weekend passes or anything?
Well, out there,
Long ways from
we
here.
would get, because of our remoteness from town, we would get every other weekend, a Saturday and Sunday, and we could go into Bakersfield or any of those places around Los Angeles, whatever. I know at first I was out there and I went to town with friend, and I think we went to Bakersfield. Well, how you gonna go? Well, you either ride with somebody that had a car, or you got out on the highway and thumbed it. Well, I could be honest with you. We could buy gas for 10 cents a gallon at that time without any tax. But you'd get out and thumb a ride, which was commonplace. If you took your ditty bag or your satchel that you had your weekend stuff in, and you took and bought cartons of cigarettes, you could take a carton of cigarettes and set it out of your duffel bag, your handbag, and get out there on the highway, and the first smoker that come by would stop and pick you up. You get in the car and they'd say, "Hey, sailor, you got any extra cigarettes?" Well, simple stuff. But then later on, you could live off base. But living off base, I was married at the time, and I rented a living quarters up at Cartago, which was back up towards Lone Pine and Big Pine, and we traded rides and lived off the base, but it was just getting by on a meager amount because of the money we made. Right off the bat, I went from apprentice seaman to, when you got out of boot camp, you was seaman second class, and then when I first got on the base in California, I was seaman first class. Then like each station or ship had a complement, and they'd have so many craftsmen of each kind. Maybe they'd have so many boatswain's mates, so many engine room people, so many aircraft mechanics. Well, when an opening come up, why, you would either get appointed or you'd take a test, and if you could pass that test, then your superiors would, and that's where I got third class pretty quick. And you had to serve so long as a third class before you went to AMM second class, was like your military sergeants, incomparable. And I got second class before I went out, and it was kind of cooling off a bit, and that's when some of us lived off the base. We had our wives down there, but you could live off the base like on weekends and that, and it made living a little nicer, and we were happy with it.
How did your wife like it down there?
Well, it was a case of where Cartago was an old, they mined stuff for soap there. Well, there was enough other Navy wives that lived in this old dwelling area that was there, that we were friends, and it was enjoyable. When you didn't know any better, well, it worked pretty good. If you had enough qualifications, they went to develop an on-station living quarters, and it started with the officers first, but I didn't last that long down there till I was discharged.
What do you remember when President Roosevelt died and what the feelings were?
Oh yeah. We were concerned. I can admit this, that some of these dates, when you get up within 30 days of 86, your memory isn't so sharp. I thought I had pretty good memory, but like D-Day, I remember it very well. Everybody was celebrating because the war was over, and then it was whenever the Japanese signed off. Each event like that, it meant something to us, and we paid attention. But when the war was over, hey, everybody was happy because we knew we were going home.
Okay. So you had been in when the war was over, you'd been in for
probably 18 months.
Yeah. And
I was in Sea Lac 3 months of, April, May, June. Lapped 90 days being 2 years, between 80 and 90 days.
so once the war was over, you didn't have enough points to.
Well, I was one of the last, would be one of the last ones. Where I drew points was because I was married.
Okay.
But it wasn't too long after the war was over, then I went to, I think, San Luis Obispo for discharge. I got my discharge papers here, and that's for San Pedro.
So after the war was over, did you just keep doing the same job, or did it kind of die down because people were leaving and plans were changing?
Yes, it was when the war was over, we kept doing the same thing. It was just lower key that they did, like rockets. We had rockets, everything from say 2-inch up to 1175 diameter rockets, and they were those that were gunnery and the civilian people involved in test. They recorded what they'd do. I know that big, that 1175 that we called it Tiny Tim, was hush hush. Nothing said about it, but they would pour concrete block 12 feet but 12-foot cube with rebar every 12 inches through that thing, and then they'd set it and fire that rocket into that with various warheads, and to see the power of it. I never witnessed myself by eye, but I knew guys that were in the gunnery that would say that it'd end up you couldn't find a piece that was much bigger than your fist when they were satisfied with it and went to something else. So
Pretty awesome.
I'm a pretty good BSer, but I try not to exaggerate too much.
So you finally get your notice to go home.
Yes.
You go to, where'd you say? San Obispo?
San Luis Obispo, I think.
And so you were mustered out there.
Right.
Did they make any attempt to keep you in the Navy, or?
Yes. because aviation machinist mates or aircraft maintenance personnel was shorthand. I was a second class. They had what they had for a reserve program. I had a choice of 5 bases I could have went to. I think San Diego and a Texas base, a base on the East Coast, but there was 5 major Navy bases, and I could re-enlist and supposedly for reserves. Well, I liked the job. I liked aircraft. I liked the things that we did. And when I got home, I was talking to my dad about it, and they were recruiting to get to go back in. They offered me to go from second class AMM to first class machinist mate if I could pass the test. The time lag period would be ignored, and I could have picked one of those 5 bases to go to. Well, I talked to Dad, and he said, "You have no business re-enlisting." And I'll tell you why. He says they'll stir up problems over in Asia. And he said, I said, "I'm gonna be on a reserve base. I'm on reserve." "Yeah." He said, "You'll be reserved." He said, "You'll be one of the first rated people on a flat top going over there to get mixed up in another war." And oh, he was so right.
What did your wife think about re-enlisting?
Well, she wasn't really for or against it to express herself, but of course she knew what my dad had said, and it was family-wise. I know parents-wise, my wife didn't. She lived with the folks maybe for a matter of a week or 2, but we were on our own. The folks said, like Dad said, whenever I started getting interested in the girls, he says, "I'll tell you one thing, son. A home is big enough but for one family. And if you get married, you're going to have to." Well, I'd already got married before I went in service, and we had made a home and rented and so on, so that wasn't so much trouble. I might say this, that when was on the air base, say at China Lake or Armitage Field, each plane had a complement. You could take this TBM that sits out here in the hangar. There was the pilot, and then 2, the top turret and the bottom one. Well, in order to have a crew, why, we would get flight pay, which was 50% increase in your base salary for flying. Well, we was allotted flight pay for every plane we had. Well, those that were the pilot and then a crew, we would fly with them. Well, then later on they decided that if they lose a plane, they lose a crew, and we went from being manpower flying in them with the pilot, they went to sandbagging. In other words, so many sandbags equal to weight. But that's when I say I have flew quite a few hours at TBM or Curtiss SB-2C, and even we had the old PBYs at that time. Of course, that was multi-engine. We had PV-2s, which was Hudson. Even had B-25s. Well, that's where we would get flying time. You not only done your work, but you flew enough to get your flight pay.
So you've got to fly in a lot of different planes. then.
Yes, you
And you got to
did.
fly in an Avenger.
No, not, well, Grumman, well, the TBM, but see, by the time I got out of the Navy, our aircraft was all internal combustion engines, prop driven, right up till just before I got out. Why, Ryan Fireball come out with a jet. Whenever we'd get a new plane on the base, it was customary that they'd bring it in, buzz the hangar, go up and do some acrobats, and come back and then sit down. Well, here come this plane, and they buzzed the base where the hangar was and went up and turned around and come back, and they come back and appeared to be going just as fast, but the prop was fully feathered. The engine wasn't turning. Well, it had a jet in the back and a internal combustion engine in the front. That plane never materialized. The theory was they could cruise with the Ryan Fireball and patrol, and then if they got in combat condition, they'd turn that jet on and they'd outrun anything that was 500-600.
So anyway, you didn't re-enlist.
No,
And you didn't.
no, and I went right back to working construction work, and I went back to Anderson Dam and worked, and I worked out here at Lucky Peak on this dam here. Well, I went back to Fairfield, and I went to work for Bunting Tractor Company under a training program to work in the shop under diesel mechanics. And hey, it was a job, but it was a lot of different from aircraft in that aircraft was clean. Everything you messed around with a Caterpillar or farm tractor was, and heavy. You couldn't, parts were heavy. Well, then that training deal happened to fold up, and in so doing I come back down to Boise and went to work at Lucky Peak Dam running dirt movers again, and I stayed out there from the time it was just started good until it was finished. But I never, to go back into military or that. I did check on reserve training here in Boise, but they didn't have any Navy reserves that had aircraft to do with it. And as a result, I never was in any reserve program other than subject to call for so many years.
So when Korea happened, you didn't.
No, I was plumb out and
Didn't have to worry.
Korean, and that's where the story that my dad had said.
Yeah.
Yeah, it come along, and had re-enlisted, I'd have been right in the middle of it. And then it come, it's been since.
Okay.
A history of, after Korea, it was Vietnam, and I can very well respect those military folks that served in Korea, Vietnam, even up what you got right now going on. Their state of mind has got to be comparable to what World War II was, but I'm sure that their thoughts about it was a little bit different,
So did you use the GI Bill for anything?
Yes, I went, and then when I wasn't able to go to college right out of high school, and I was working, like I say, at Lucky Peak, I went to Lynx Business School, which was a far cry from doing heavy equipment to pushing pencil. And I took a course from just basic accounting plumb through to advanced accounting. And then I had an idea that, I didn't get a sheepskin. I got a certificate for having completed that course. But BJC, 2 years. BJC was a 2-year school. Well, then I decides I'll go back and go to BJC with a business course so I can get a bachelor's degree maybe in it. Well, I went there. I hadn't gone very long, and one of the professors said, "I want to talk to you after class." And I thought, what the devil did I do? There was the younger folks that was students, the older ones, and he said, "Where'd you go to school before?" And I said, "Why?" And I told him I'd went to Lynx. He said, "I figured so. Why are you here?" Well, I told him I wanted to be able to get a degree from a accredited college, and he gave me advice. He says, "Keep your mouth shut and just take the courses. Don't ever let anybody know." Well, and he told me, he said, "You seem to know too damn much about it for not having gone to school." Well, being noisy, maybe I talked out of turn. I don't think so. But anyway, I went then to within just less than 90 days of graduating and ended up in a divorce, and I never did finish BJC.
Oh. So, did you do any, did you join the American Legion or any of them kind of?
I've belonged to the Legion virtually ever since I got out of service. There was a time that I changed from post 19 at Fairfield and come down here, and I joined here in Boise. And then it was so political, I dropped it and went back, and I rejoined in Fairfield, and I've had my membership up there for without attending, other than just periodic, for right up to date. I've participated 100% of the time.
Did you keep in touch with people you knew in the military?
Really not. I could kick my pants for not having kept in touch, but there was people scattered all over the United States, and there was one or two of them that I kept track of for a short time, or they kept track of me. There was a Barney Ingvaldson out of Minnesota. He even talked to Little Brook. He, at one time, borrowed money to go home on leave. Then we got discharged. And it wasn't much. I think he had borrowed $15 from me to help. Well, charge it up for what it was. But he sent that back to me plumb after I was out of the service.
Well, that's good.
And that's when it come. And there was a couple other guys that we didn't visit that much. There was a fellow from over at Rigby that I visited with a little, but really didn't keep up with him.
So in looking back, what is your feelings about your service in the military?
Well, I think it was great. I was at a time in life where I think military service would help a lot of these misdirected teens that we got right now, and that let their hip pockets get down behind their knees, and they got to put screwball tattoos and buttons in their nose and that kind of stuff.
Wouldn't the
It'd
Navy-
help them grow up.
Yeah. Okay. Is there anything else you wanted to add to your story?
No, I don't think so. Quite, I know when I was in the service and even living off, whether I was on the base or otherwise, it was enjoyable. Like I say, there was Armitage Field and then they built China Lake. Well, I could go, we got the weekend off every other week. Well, instead of going to town a lot, I went over and would hire out as a cat skinner to the contractor. And they would let, if a military guy, all Navy guys are painters, but we could work because they needed help and it was cost plus 10. But I would do that a lot early on down there till they, passed, didn't need the help, but I run heavy equipment when it was building the air base.
Well, looking back, you have a lot of things that you did. Worked on a lot of airplanes, do them, and built two of the big dams that are integral part of Idaho's commerce and everything
Yeah.
else. And we would like to end by just thanking you for your years of service and what you did for our country, and make my generation free and easier for my generation. And we appreciate that. And we appreciate you sharing your story with the museum and with the Library of Congress.
I might say this, after having worked construction work, I went to school and then I went to work for the Idaho Survey and Rating Bureau. We set the advisory fire insurance rates in Idaho.
Oh,
We graded the fire departments. We wrote reports on every commercial building in the state, published book of rates that was advisory. For 39 years, I went from blue collar, you might say, to pencil pusher, and I retired after 39 years with Idaho Survey and Rating Bureau.
well,
And
an
I
interesting
thank you.
career. So we appreciate you sharing your story with us, and thank you very much.
Well, I thank you.
All right.